Hi, everybody. Welcome to part 3 of our exciting Red May series on the collection called Marxism and the Capitalist State Towards a New Debate. I am Sean, your moderator for the day. I am so excited to be joined by our guests today. They have some excellent chapters in this collection. I've been doting on this book and talking about this book to everybody for like a year. I was excited for it when it was coming out last year, but I turned it up quite a notch when at work in a warehouse just on a normal Saturday. I arrived a little early and got to select what we were listening to. And remember, there was this great conversation among some of the authors of Marxism and the Capitalist State Toward a New Debate going on through the Marxist Education Project. And so I turned that on, and some of my coworkers that sort of trickled in, right? Not too many of us, about 7 or 8, were like, oh, okay, like they were hoping for something, maybe not like a Sunday morning sermon, if you will, at work on Saturday. However, as the event went on, they started going back and forth with each other, with me. They were asking questions, they were engaging with the work. And it was a great and wonderful moment for me. That was a real proof in the pudding that the contexts and the work around Marxism today and the critical projects of socialism alive in the world really matter, and they connect with people from the get-go. So towards that end, I'm very excited for our guests today, who I think do a really good job in their chapters of connecting to the world in a really tangible way. So today we are joined by Eva Nanopoulos, Rafael Khachaturian, and Stephen Maher. I think the order is going to be Rafael, and then Eva and Steve. Then we will have a little discussion in between and then work our way into Q&A. If you're tuning in from YouTube and want to jump in the chat, feel free to ask questions and post comments, etc. there. We also accept anything from any way you can get it to us. So, if you want to comment on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, if you want to reach out via email, or, you can call me if you need to call my mom and have her text me if there's an emergency to answer your question. Just, if it's on your mind, let us know, because we'd like to get it out there to these brilliant people. So I'm going to do a little introduction and then pass it off to them. So Eva Nanopoulos is a senior lecturer in law at Queen Mary, University of London. She's the author of Juridification of Sanctions and the Politics of EU Law, and co-author to The Crisis Behind the Euro Crisis. The Euro crisis is a multi-dimensional systemic crisis of the EU, as well as a co-editor to this excellent collection we have today. You can read her and Rafael and Rob's great introduction to the book for free, I think, on Access from Palgrave, right? We're going to put that link up right now for all that are interested in that. Eva wrote the entry for the Material Constitution and Imperialism for the recent Cambridge Handbook on the Material Constitution, as well as numerous entries for the Cambridge Yearbook of Legal Studies and Cambridge Law Review, as well as for something I love, the great LPE projects going on today. Rafael Khachaturian is a lecturer in critical writing at the Marx Family Center for Excellence in Writing at the University of Pennsylvania, and an affiliate of the Department of Political Science and the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy, as well as an associate with a faculty member of the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, another long admired associate of Red May. If you haven't taken anything at BISR, please do. You're missing out. If you have, then you know what you're into, and go take some more classes. Rafael, in addition to being a co-editor to Marxism and the Capitalist State, you can find his work in journals such as Polity, Contemporary Political Theory, Political Research Quarterly, Historical Materialism, Science and Society, and Jacobin. Stephen Maher is assistant professor of economics at SUNY Cortland and associate editor of the Socialist Register. He's also the author of Corporate Capitalism and the Integral State, General Electric, and a Century of American Power, an amazing book, I might add, and it has my strong personal endorsement to the world. He's also a co-author with Scott Aquino of the equally amazing Fall and Rise of American Finance, from J.P. Morgan to BlackRock, which is also something we had at a Red May event about earlier this year. You should check it out in our archives at youtube.com/redmaytv. But in addition to this, he is also a co-author of The Socialist Challenge Today with Sam Ginnon and the late, great Leo Panitch. You can find more of his other publications in Science and Society, Critical Sociology, Socialist Register, and Jacobin. So Eva, Rafael, and Steve, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to listen and learn from you. Eva, take it away.
I actually.
I got out of order. Apologies, guys. Rafael, you're first. Forgive me. Forgive me my sins and trespasses, friends.
Sean, thank you. Thanks to Sean Mahim and the rest of the Red May team for organizing and inviting all of us contributors to participate in Red May. I think I speak for all of the contributors of the volume when I say that we're really big fans of Red May. We've been following the project for years, and joining as many of these events as you've been putting on, and it's really an honor to be here, and also to be at this kind of like final panel to maybe wrap up some of the things that we've been discussing for the past week and a half, and also put forward some provisional analyses of our own. So I'm going to begin by get us started by talking a little bit about my chapter for this volume, which is called Crisis, Social Reproduction, and the Capitalist State, Notes on an Uncertain Conjuncture. My chapter was written between late 2022 and early 2023, at a moment when the COVID pandemic was still very much on everyone's mind. It was an attempt to really analyze the relationship between crisis, social reproduction, and the capitalist state, precisely as they were articulated during this moment that I call the COVID conjuncture, which I roughly pinpoint to about 2020 to 2022 as kind of like the height of that moment. Of course, many people at the time, pretty much as soon as the pandemic hit, had written about the way that the COVID crisis was not only a kind of unprecedented conjunctural crisis in some way, or perhaps one of those that only occurs once every century, let's say, but it also had certain structural and organic dimensions as well. In some analyses, it was a kind of fusion of multiple various crises that had been, culminating and had finally been articulated into a new kind of potentially ruptural moment. My chapter tries to really grapple with this question of what it means to understand the role of the state and the way that the capitalist state was embedded within these processes at the time. Most of all, we know that pretty much as soon as the pandemic hit, we can recall that there were calls and expectations for the state to really act as a source of social protection. You had sort of protectionist right-wing versions of this analysis as kind of articulated, in the United States with the Trump presidency at the time. But also you had kind of a socialist or progressive democratic version of that as well, also calling for the state to really take on this new role of provision of public services, of social protection, of public health at an unprecedented time. My argument in this chapter is actually that what the pandemic made clear is that the capitalist state is either incapable of or unwilling to care for its citizens in the way that these wishes were being projected onto it at the time. What we see is actually the state's inability to convincingly reconcile the competing priorities that the capitalist state is tasked with within the capitalist mode of production. Um, in a moment, I'm going to talk about what those are, but for the moment, I can just say that those are accumulation, right, legitimation, and social reproduction. What we have after 2020 is actually the deepening of a pre-existing crisis that reaffirms the capitalist character of the state in a way that prevents it from actually uh, simply being put to use to counter the needs or the tendencies of capital accumulation in the way that some on the left might wish. My chapter looks specifically at the US, and it proceeds from a kind of more general reflection on the characteristics of the capitalist state, and then proceeds to the more concrete moment of the way that the American state responded to the crisis in that roughly 2 year conjuncture. But I do think that some of these conclusions that I draw are potentially generalizable to other capitalist states in the global north. Although, of course, we can also talk about important differences that might come up. Uh, Part of my chapter tackles this new phenomenon of neo-statism that I mentioned a moment ago. The argument or the idea that what the pandemic has revealed is a new push for social protection on the part of the state. That the state is able to, in some ways, act as a organized form of coercive power that is capable of contravening or acting against the short-term imperatives of capital accumulation, and being put to use in quite liberal, progressive ways to actually uh, organize and help organize working class demands and articulate them on a political level. I do not find these arguments especially convincing because what in my reading, what they tend to do is to see the state as external to capitalist social relations. So, on the one hand, you have a vision of kind of a certain understanding of the logic of capitalism, which operates in accordance with the kind of law of the accumulation of value. And on the other hand, you have the state and state institutions which have developed relatively autonomously. And in some cases, they might, you know, they have their own organizational rationale and logic. And in some cases, they might come into contact with capitalist social relations and help facilitate them, but there's no necessary, let's say, structural connection between the two. I argue that what this does is actually helps reproduce an old dichotomy that has been kind of a long-running thread within Marxist attempts to theorize the capitalist state, which is on the one hand, you seeing the state as an instrument or a tool in the hands of a class, as you have with rather crude instrumentalist understandings. So the state is controlled by the capitalist class and just simply directly reproduces their needs and their demands. In which case, the argument would be that if the left can take power, occupy the high offices of the state, then the state can simply be reorganized or reoriented towards more progressive social causes. On the other hand, there's an argument that the state has its own autonomy and rationale that, again, is more or less um, unanchored from the demands of capital accumulation, or that the state has its own capacity to push back against the long-term economic interests of the capitalist class. I don't think either one of these adequately captures how social classes and class struggle are actually interior to the capitalist state. That it's not the case that we simply have class struggle unfolding more or less autonomously outside of the institutions of the state. And on the other hand, you have state institutions that operate according to their own kind of internal organizational logic. Class struggles are always inserted within and entwined within the actual institutions and sinews of the capitalist state. By trying to move past that kind of dichotomy and looking at the way that state institutions respond to and are always trying to both organize and structure, but also in some cases might be ruptured by class struggle and class relations, only then can we actually begin to think more, I think, more accurately about what state crisis might mean, given kind of certain unprecedented conjunctures, as we have seen over the last few years. My chapter starts out by sketching what I mentioned a moment ago, which are three general roles that the capitalist state plays within the capitalist mode of production. Um, an important distinction that I draw analytically is between what I call a capitalist state, which is a kind of theoretically constructed object of knowledge, and states as they exist in capitalism. Because again, the latter simply reproduces a certain dichotomy in terms of capitalist social relations and state organization as more or less separate from each other. Um, the three general functions or roles of the capitalist state, as I mentioned a moment ago, are capital accumulation, social reproduction, and ideological legitimation. So, what do I mean by capital accumulation? It's the whole range of activities that the state plays a role in order to preserve public order, generate fiscal and monetary order, and reproduce it. Um, facilitate public credit, provide infrastructure and other favorable investment conditions, and also generate and enforce contracts. So uphold the legal form, um, private property, the commodification of labor power, all that kind of infrastructural, institutional um, grounding for the successful accumulation of capital, which is the more of the focus of my chapter here. Um, There we can kind of notice that there's a gradual emergence of the social welfare state over the course of the late 19th and early 20th century, um, as class struggles in the global north, but also in parts of the global semi-periphery and periphery, push capitalist states to take on these new socially protective roles or functions. So we can think of universal public education, child and elder care, social housing, pensions. All of these, on the one hand, are cast in the kind of social democratic guise as precisely having that socially protective dimension that people wish the capitalist state still had. Um, on the other hand, they are necessary for the reproduction of the labor force itself, right? This is the socially reproductive aspect of that. And lastly, ideological legitimation. So what we call political democracy, popular sovereignty, citizenship as a kind of universal value that uh, into which subjects are interpolated from a young age. Basically, the representation of universal interests contra class-based interests, the projection of a universality or a certain homogeneity onto the social body, rather than acknowledging the actual divisions that exist in capitalist society. So these three general roles are more or less abstractions. Obviously, the way that each one of these gets articulated and plays out in specific social formations under capitalism is different, right? They vary across time and space. But nevertheless, I think we can use these three as kind of anchoring points then to make meaningful comparisons about both how states can and cannot accomplish these at the same time. And in my view, there's always a tension or a contradiction between these three demands, right? Especially between capital accumulation uh, on the one hand and social reproduction and ideological legitimation on the other. So what happens? What happens after the decline of the social democratic welfare state as a kind of ideal type that we tend to pinpoint towards the 1970s, right? There's this moment um, in the histories of this phenomenon that we call neoliberalism. There's a narrative in which basically neoliberalism emerges out of a period of economic and political crises in the 1970s and is marked by also changes in the corresponding form of the capitalist state during that time. Um, Both Steve and Ava's chapters in the volume tackle this shift and these changes institutionally in a variety of dimensions. But generally speaking, what we can see is that if we think of periodizing neoliberalism, we can roughly pinpoint it to about a regime of accumulation and a certain hegemonic project that began in earnest in the late 1970s and lasted through the 2010s. I think we can discuss whether or not what we still have today is neoliberalism in some mutated form, whether neoliberalism has been left behind altogether. I think that this is kind of an open question, and I don't want to necessarily say that we've definitively moved beyond it. But I do think the changes that we've noticed over the past just within this decade do give us reason to think that we are undergoing certain important changes beyond the kind of like high point of neoliberalism in the 1990s or early 2000s, right? Um, so when we think of the way that the political institutions of neoliberalism coalesced during that time, um, we're familiar with this notion of authoritarian statism as developed by Nikos Poulantzas in the late 1970s at the kind of cusp of that moment. And lately, in more recent years, there's been a wave of scholarship that has also discussed this term authoritarian neoliberalism as a kind of modification of that political form, indicating a regime of perpetual crisis management um, that's based on a certain ideological depoliticization of society on the one hand, and also by facilitating the interests of capital accumulation through the state, while at the same time doing away largely with the popular democratic accountability that characterized the social welfare states of the mid 20th century and their specific institutional form that they took. Um, Roughly from 2007 to present, I think what we can consider is that neoliberalism has existed more or less as a regime of permanent exception. That the capitalist state has to fulfill certain competing priorities of accumulation, reproduction, and legitimation. But under authoritarian neoliberalism specifically, if we think of social reproduction and the way that that has changed, um, we can think of certain examples, right? So care work, for example, has been externalized onto families and communities by diminishing the public capacity of the state to actually provide it through, privatization has basically eroded public institutions that had previously provided universal education, um, pensions, other forms of childcare, etc. Um, the cost of social reproduction has been shifted basically onto the working class in the global north. At the same time as class and racial and gender divisions within divisions of labor within these societies have also facilitated to creating kind of what Nancy Fraser has called global care chains. Basically, workers from the global south migrating to the global north in order to then support um, those social reproductive needs of wealthier families in the global north. So how does this regime of permanent exception or perpetual crisis management resonate within this more concrete conjuncture of the U.S. circa of recent years? Again, 2020 to roughly 2022, if we can think of just like the height of the pandemic. What I argue in my chapter is that basically the 2008 financial crisis and the Great Recession was an economic crisis uh, that was successfully resolved by massive state intervention, as Steve and Scott wonderfully articulate in their chapter and also in their recent book. Um, but what this did was, it displaced the kind of contradiction that emerged in capital accumulation during that moment, from the economic to the ideological and political level. Right. So successfully resolving the economic crisis meant that the state had to step in, but it had to push through very unpopular measures that basically had certain political and ideological effects. Among these were the kind of, in the United States, the kind of crisis of the bipartisan neoliberal consensus that had previously existed between the two ruling parties. Um, you saw kind of manifestations of this earlier on with the Tea Party movement and its kind of mutation into Trumpism, and as well on the left with Occupy Wall Street and Bernie Sanders, right? So you had kind of economic grievances that were then being articulated on a political level in certain forms. But what the COVID shock did was actually it exacerbated the crisis of social reproduction that had already existed as a result of all of these tendencies that I mentioned a moment ago, that externalization of care work and the privatization of care that had already been unfolding. We saw this in the way that the division of labor was immediately framed as one of essential versus inessential workers, right? Um, Essential workers were basically being exposed on the front lines to an unknown virus at a time when we had no idea how it spread, what its effects were, and so on. Our patchwork medical system, already rife with racialized and gendered and class inequalities, uh, came strained and came very close to collapse in many highly densely populated urban areas, but also in under-resourced rural areas. We got very conflicting messaging from authorities about how do you handle the pandemic, right? Ava's chapter, for example, discusses that metaphor of going to war against the pandemic as one way in which this was publicly presented. But there was also immediate capitalist pressure for a quick return to normalization, right? Reopening businesses, uh, grandma must die so that the economy may live, et cetera, et cetera. And lastly, the I think insufficient progressive legislation that was proposed during the first year of Biden's term was immediately stalled or whittled down in Congress. Again, kind of indicating that there was a certain political crisis at the moment that also prevented the successful resolution of the social crisis that was happening. So the interesting thing, though, is that even though we have a kind of crisis of popular democratic legitimacy that has been unfolding since 2008, and now a crisis of social reproduction, a much more acute one that has been happening over the last few years. Um, there has not really been a crisis of capital accumulation on my reading. The process of capital accumulation has remained pretty unaffected. We have record corporate profits. Transnational capital flows are largely unimpeded. You have a kind of continuation of the post 2008 status quo in terms of capital circulation. I'm sure Steve is going to speak more about this in his talk, but essentially, we don't have the kind of neo-statist social protectionism um, that many anticipated would be the new normal in the during the height of the pandemic. The state basically continues to consolidate and facilitate the interests of corporate capital, and the U.S. state remains the linchpin of the global capitalist order, all the while at the ongoing expense of popular democratic and social reproduction and the roles that the state plays in those moments. So basically, again, you have a kind of sharpening of a contradiction on the one hand between the three kind of primary responsibilities of the capitalist state. So where does this leave us? I want to wrap up and just you know kind of end with where I leave the chapter. Looking ahead, we can kind of keep in mind that neoliberalism was born out of a period of capitalist crisis, the late 1970s, the crisis of capital accumulation that was happening during that decade. And now it's muddling through another one, but now crisis of a distinct sort. Crises in general are periods where the state's ability to organize class hegemony becomes less effective. Uh, the hegemonic bloc that the state is responsible for upholding begins to fracture, and existing modes of representation become discredited and contested, as we are seeing not just in the United States, but really all across developed capitalist democracies in the global north. Um, there's a quote by Gramsci. We all know the famous quote about the interregnum, but there's another variation of the quote where, just to paraphrase, it says that an interregnum is a moment where the working classes know that things cannot remain the same, but the ruling class has not yet figured out how to change things for their benefit. So it's a moment in which there's that uncertainty kind of reigns in terms of these shifting class dynamics. But importantly, capitalist crisis does not mean pending capitalist collapse, right? We need to kind of disentangle crisis and collapse in the strong sense of the word. Um, the state's ability to facilitate capitalist accumulation is still, I think, very much in force. But it no longer has that kind of popular reproductive role, at least in the form that it had in the early years of the neoliberal project, and before then in the, you could say, kind of post-war social democratic form. Um, this means that the state is becoming increasingly repressive. It's becoming increasingly incapable of um, sort of navigating and articulating capitalist interest into a stable, durable formation. It's increasingly resorting to emergency forms of governance in order to kind of continue fulfilling its role and kind of chugging along. And essentially, we're dealing with a kind of prolonged impasse at the moment. Crises are also periods of relative indeterminacy, right? They're complex, they have multiple causes. Economic crisis does not necessarily lead to political crisis and vice versa. Sometimes you have crises that kind of can remain somewhat sealed, at least kind of in terms of their immediate effects. Um, but they are also relatively open-ended, right? They can also be windows of opportunity for social mobilization, and their outcome themselves is determined by the balance of forces in social struggle at a given moment. But the point that I want to kind of end on is that absent a revolutionary mobilization of forces, more than likely crises are going to become windows of opportunity for the ruling class to reorganize and reassert their power in new forms. So we can think of the fascist interregnum of the 1920s and 1930s as the example, right? Which um, the the crushing of post 1917 revolutionary movements across Europe gave rise to uh, bourgeois domination in a new form, right? In a qualitatively new form of fascism. So state strategies for in response to the pandemic today potentially have the basis to become a new regime of accumulation, right? A kind of post-neoliberal but still very capitalist regime of accumulation, one whose features are still very blurry, but potentially are coming into sharper focus just in the present. With each crisis and each resolution of the crisis um, by the state on the state's terms, the bar is lowered further and further in terms of social services, in terms of pushback against privatization, etc. So crises become opportunities for the ruling powers to re-articulate what then becomes the new normal, the new baseline on which bourgeois class rule continues. So I think I'll leave it at that, and I'm looking forward to the conversation with everyone.
Thanks for that, Rafael. I'm curious after listening to the sort of this like torsion, a word I use too much. Everybody always makes fun of me for this, but this problem of the existence or nature of a protective state or a protective capitalist state. It's failing at being able to achieve this outside of its own terms. Outside of terms of the social reproduction of capital. I'm curious how you got into this, how you found yourself into this personally, if there was anything about your experience that sort of connected and drove you to this maddening struggle. Yeah, maddening for me. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, without getting too biographical about it, I think being your typical millennial, I was going through the recession and like graduating college right into the recession of 2008, and then having to figure out, you know, how and why the capitalist system that we're already kind of like skeptical about, but then kind of just like seeing it in full-fledged crisis, and then seeing the way that that was resolved. Um, I think led me to start asking those kinds of questions. Early on, but more immediately, it was really looking at that 2020 moment and looking at how much people, I think, on the progressive and social democratic left were projecting their hopes onto the Biden presidency as being that muscular moment of the reassertion of kind of progressive state power for working class interests, for you know against the rule of capital, against the way that that post 2008 landscape had unfolded. And I think many of us were rightly skeptical about people's enthusiasm for that. Steve and I have had, I think, many conversations about this over those years, and so this chapter, in a way, was my attempt to kind of grapple with that phenomenon and try to problematize it by bringing the insights of Marxist state theorizing back into that conversation, which I think it had been pushed out of the way prior to then.
Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it. I like to find out all the inside information on people's personal lives and what their experience is, for a variety of reasons. But anyway, Eva, it is your turn. Thank you all. Thanks, Raf.
Hello there, everyone. Can you hear me well? Yeah, great. So thanks very much for the invitation to participate in this. It's really a great honor. It's actually, in theory, probably my first talk in the US, even though I'm in Greece and not in the US. So it's a real pleasure to be here and to sort of discuss some of my thoughts with not the usual suspects that I find myself encountering. So in a sense, my chapter is not only or not primarily related to the theory of the state as such, as much as to a theory of a particular modality of state power. And that modality of state power I call the war and emergency paradigm, which I define basically as the twin deployment, first, of the language of war, and second, of an exceptional legal arsenal. Okay? And this is being deployed in moments where the capitalist state is in crisis of some form or another. Now, one thing in the discussion we might want to also pick up on is to link back to Raf, the relationship between this war and emergency paradigm that I have in mind and more classical expressions of the exception or the fascist or the authoritarian state, because I do think that there's something specific about this new modality of state power that is more, it's historically specific more to the 21st century, basically, in a certain way. So I would quite like perhaps to reflect on this. In any event, so I had worked in the past on war and emergencies as modalities of state power, particularly in the context of the war on drugs and the war on terror. Those of you in the US will be all too familiar with these many imagined wars. But I think the question presented itself in a new light with the pandemic and the climate crisis, okay? And raising in particular a practical question about what should a left strategy consist of. Should we be embracing this war and emergency paradigm, or should we reject it, okay? And in that sense, I think the pandemic was different because, or the climate emergency is different because, on the one hand, at the very least, the threat is not imagined, it's real. And on the other hand, we do require exceptional urgent measures that basically rupture with the order of capital accumulation. So in that sense, for me, the war emergency paradigm in the context of the pandemic and the climate crisis should be seen not only as a tool of class war, but also as a manifestation of a capitalist crisis. So it has always these two logics brought together under it, which creates a certain contradiction as well, as I'll come to. Now, I wasn't obviously the only one to pick up on this new conjuncture of the pandemic, of the climate crisis, and but in the literature, there's been, broadly speaking, only two camps. The reject camp, which basically draws no distinction between the war on terror or the climate emergency, and just advocates an outward rejection of, the war metaphor or an exceptional legal regime. And this usually followed also in the line of sort of Agamben thoughts on the state of exception more generally, for those of you that are familiar with his work. But then we saw the emergence for the first time of a second camp, what I call the embrace camp, which we can see in the writing of people like Zizek or Andreas Malm, who, although they have very different positions on all this, broadly support a politics of war and emergency as a sort of almost the other side of the coin of disaster capitalism. Now, for me, really, this dichotomy of rejection or embrace has two problems. The first is that the debate is ultimately shaped by what are liberal lines that really assume a very rigid distinction between war and peace and law and normality, which Marxist thought generally have convincingly sought to show is not the case, that, these are just different expressions of the dictatorship of the proletariat, but of the bourgeoisie, sorry, but not kind of fundamentally qualitatively different, okay? And my second problem was that to the extent that some Marxists adopt a slightly more newer position that was neither to reject nor embrace, and one that emphasizes the contradictions inherent in capital's social forms, including the war emergency paradigm, they apply this only to the state and not to the war and emergency paradox as such. Now, what do I mean? Toscano, for example, argues that the ambivalence towards, that the pandemic revealed an ambivalence towards the state that mirrors a broader antinomy that is written into the very structure of capitalist society. Namely, to quote him, the desire for the state and the often all too justified fear of the state on the one hand, and between the momentary primacy of the state and the structuring primacy of the economic on the other hand. And this he takes as encapsulating sort of the contradiction of asking for more or less state. I want basically to extend his analysis to the war and emergency paradigm, because for him, to articulate this ambivalence in martial terms, it's already a symptom of our cramped political imaginary and rhetoric, okay? But there's no reason why we should only look at the martial metaphor in this kind of one-sided way. As I recall in the piece, the paradigm builds on a long history of war and emergency as colonial and counter-revolutionary tools, but it is also the case that many revolutions have sprung after out of the ashes of war and repression. The Paris Commune is one such example, even if they were ultimately unsuccessful. And we have, if we look at grassroots movements, various instances of deployment of the war metaphor for more progressive ends, such as, for example, in the context of the AIDS epidemic or the fight against cancer. So against this background, I propose to sort of shift the emphasis, and I want to read the war and emergency paradigm, offer a new reading, building this time on Marxist theories of war and emergency, particularly going back to the writings of Marx and Engels. Now, in the first section of my piece, I first look at the war and emergency paradigm through the lens of pacification theory, okay? The first is pacification theory. Now, pacification theory is, in my view, the closest example we have of a systematic examination of the war and emergency paradigm that draws on Marx's writings and has been influential more generally on questions of war, accumulation, and policing, including in the US. Their starting point basically is a critique of security, and they build specifically on the Jewish question, where Marx said that security is the highest social concept of civil society, the concept of police, expressing the fact that the whole of society exists only in order to guarantee to each of its members the preservation of his person, his rights, and his property. Okay? From this basic observation, pacification theory reaches a number of conclusions. First, that security, not liberty or freedom, is the epicenter of bourgeois society, that security is ultimately about policing, understood not in the liberal sense of law enforcement, but just in the wider and more productive sense of fabricating and reproducing the order of wage labor. And that this policing function underwrites all institutions and practices of bourgeois society. That is to say that there is no rigid distinction between war and peace, law and normality, as all of them ultimately are connected to the policing of the capitalist order. Okay? So from their perspective, like the actual empirical wars of accumulation that preceded them, the many metaphorical wars and emergency regimes of the last few decades, including the war against COVID, are basically but forms of policing of class war from above in the name of capital accumulation. Okay? And so for them, the answer then is neither to reject or embrace the war on emergency paradigm, but to move altogether beyond it, which for them they do through their politics of what they call anti-security. Now, pacification theory, in my view, does an excellent job of addressing the first problem. That is, to overcome the artificial distinction between war and peace, law and normality, showing them to be just banal liberal dichotomies designed to hide the connection between capital accumulation and the bourgeois state. And in so doing, I think it very rightly warns us against the pitfalls of both a politics of rejection and a politics of embrace. Okay? So basically, pacification theory brings that kind of nuance to the debate. But for me, it still suffers from two main problems that I try to overcome by going back to the writings of Marx. The first is, in seeking to retrieve the connections between the war on emergency paradigm and capital accumulation, pacification theory focuses mainly on wars of accumulation. It does not explore other forms of war, anti-colonial wars, revolutionary wars, or inter-imperialist wars. And as a result, also, the war on emergency paradigm is invariably a new form of war on policing, derives, so to speak, from a kind of narrow understanding of war and emergency, one that does not actually look at the multiple usages in which it has put in the process of social transformation. Second of all, and I can say more about this in the Q&A, I think pacification theory ultimately tends to bracket the class struggle, okay? For the most part, pacification theory endorses the class struggle as an explanatory tool, that is to say, as a factor that explains how we got there, how we got to the war on emergency paradigm, but not as a political tool in and of itself. That is to say, that the class struggle could also use back this war on emergency paradigm to open up new ways of transcending the extant order. Okay, so they don't have this kind of more presentist and kind of continuously relevance of the class struggle for whether we should reject or embrace these kinds of exceptional modalities of state power. So to overcome this problem, I turn to the writing of Marx and Engels, and that begins basically, it's a different way of reading his work and their work, which begins not with a critique of security and bourgeois society, but with their own deployment of the war metaphor, its relationship more generally to the process, like their theory of historical change, and hence its relationship to the class struggle and revolution. And then I'll be quite brief. Following Balibar, I argue basically that the war metaphor in Marx forms the essence of Marx's conceptions of the political under capitalism, and hence to the possibility of socialist revolution. What we have in Marx, and I go through his writings in the Poverty of Philosophy or the Communist Manifesto, is not the kind of Clausewitz model that conceives of war as a politics by other means, neither Foucault's conception of politics as war by other means, but along the lines suggested by Balibar, war as politics, as the becoming visible of the class struggle. So when Marx and Engels deploy the language of class war, they signify both the politicization of the class struggle, it's becoming visible, but also the possibility of socialist revolution, because only under capitalism is the class struggle manifested in a war where the social antagonism have been simplified and where the capitalist class and the order of wage labor can confront one another. Okay? So from that perspective, my argument, and it's quite lengthy, but is basically that if we follow Marx and Engels, the war on emergency paradigm is not necessarily only a form of class war from above, but at a particular moment in the becoming visible of the class struggle. Okay? And hence, when we think about the war on emergency paradigm, we should really just try and think about the ways in which its deployment can prevent us from achieving emancipatory change, or on the contrary, conjunctions where it might actually be enabling. Okay? And the remainder and last part of the piece is just to offer some very tentative thoughts about how Marx and Engels would have themselves navigated the concrete dilemmas raised by the war on emergency paradigm in concepts like the climate emergency or the pandemic. And here I show that Marx and Engels were both ambivalent about the relationship between the class war and bourgeois rights. Okay, so on some occasions, for example, they support a defense of political democracy as something Marxists should pursue, and at other times, of course, we know that they reject the politics of embracing bourgeois rights because it ultimately only reproduces the capital accumulation. However, I also show that the same ambivalence is also present in the analysis of war and empirical wars, moments of crisis. Okay? And there's many examples in their writings where war can very often be seen as a source of nationalism, of class division, of chauvinism, and painted in a negative light, but also many moments where the war on emergency paradigm, where the language of war and a situation of crisis can fuel the class struggle, okay? And hence can provide a productive language and modality of state power through which to pursue revolutionary objectives. So on that basis, my overall conclusion is neither to reject nor to embrace. Instead, I argue that the question can never be determined in the abstract, because these are not really two antagonism forms of state power. That we should obviously always be mindful of the real limitations that the bourgeois state imposes on the class struggle. But in deciding in any particular conjuncture, okay, whether to embrace or reject something like a politics of exception is, for me, fundamentally a question of tactic. One that is theoretically informed, but also a political calculation about whether to embrace or reject the war paradigm, and which may yield very different answers in different conjunctures. And I'll end on that. So basically, this is my own conclusion, and that's a chart through trying to sort of juxtapose two different types of writings, pacification theory and Marx's writing on the class metaphor. Hope that made some kind of sense.
No, that was extremely cogent and very engaging. Thank you so much for that. I'm curious how you, Eva, came to a place. On the one hand, I am only making an assumption here. I just know that the Greek context from the mid 20th century to the 21st has been one that feels like the navigation of the war and emergency paradigm has been constant. You know, like the Greek experience is very singular in a lot of ways through that. So I wonder if there might be personal experience with that. But on the other hand, too, I'm curious where the intersection of the navigating this paradigm, how it comes about on the terrain specifically of law and law that you're interested in. I've noticed a lot of your work on sanctions, for example. I'm just curious if there's any intersection there. Maybe there's not.
Absolutely.
I don't know.
So, I mean, on the first question, the Greek crisis, that's interesting. Obviously, yes, the Greek crisis basically is a whole history of emergency measures after emergency measures, right? So we have typically bills passing in front of parliament of 300 pages, people having, be given an hour to go through the entire document and ratify it. So, it was a constant politics of the exception. But I think, again, and this is where my approach is different. In the Greek context, of course, I wouldn't have supported that. But in that context, that politics of emergency was imposed from above, from the European Union, okay? Of course, in concert with some involvement of local actors, but still, okay? And there was no real way in which that particular kind of politics of exception could easily be sort of redirected into basically more emancipatory goals for Greek society, because the whole crisis of Greek society was also manufactured. The Greek crisis was not a real crisis. I mean, there was a sovereign debt crisis, okay, for sure, but it's a crisis whose interpretation is overdetermined by what the EU was saying, which is that it's a sovereign debt crisis because, spending too much money, borrowing too much, recklessness, etc. So it's not that it's not a moment of crisis, but it's also a manufactured crisis. Now, I think for me, things like the pandemic or the emergency, or at least we might want to think of those as different, because they do express the conjuncture of the present moment, that we are in a deep crisis of capital, where the fact that the war paradigm has become just almost the de facto modality of state power in the global north has to tell us something about that, right? Because the state does not necessarily want, to sort of go down that route in terms of what Raf was saying, you know, processes of legitimation, for example, right? And this is why also I don't like the language of exception, because when we use the language of exception, we buy into the bourgeois state's ideology, which is to say that there's a normal law and the exception. For them, it's a different modality of state powers that always come into play at different conjunctures, depending on the crisis of capital. And I think that this language could be repurposed by grassroots movements, and it is. And yeah, so I would draw a distinction with the Greek crisis. Now, on my my connection to law, I mean, the war on emergency paradigm is not an exception. It's not the suspension of the law. It's a different modality of state power and a different legal arsenal. But these are both two facets of the capitalist state and law. Okay? So we're not, when I think of the war on emergency paradigm in legal terms, so Marx and Engels always emphasize that legal struggles are forms of class struggle, okay? Both in that they are the expression of the class struggle, like the fight over the working day, okay? But also can further fuel, provide a vehicle for class struggle, as the workers did by advocating for more or less hours of day, of work, hours of work, yeah. And for me, the war on emergency paradigm doesn't actually suspend that fact. It alters the range of arguments that we can deploy in our legal struggles, but it doesn't mean that the legal struggles or the state struggles are suspended. Because it's perfectly possible for us to argue that, you know, this particular measure that sort of goes towards meeting human needs in the pandemic and not the order of capital, okay? That this kind of argument is perfectly possible alongside a position that holds, but we should not be trumping on democratic rights, we should not descend into authoritarianism, and so on and so forth. So it is a form of legal struggle. The question of whether to embrace or to reject the war emergency paradigm remains a question of class struggle at the level of the state and class struggle at the level of the law.
Fascinating response. Really appreciate it. Thank you for that, Eva. We're going to move on to Steve now. And then after Steve, we'll have some discussion, hopefully, between you all in this engaging work. So Steve, take it away.
Okay, thanks very much, Sean. And that's like Rafael and Eva both said, it's really, really nice to be here again. I'm glad to return to Red May for the second time this year to talk about my chapter in this really excellent volume that Rafael, Eva, and Rob did us all the service of putting together, which, you know, in general updates and pushes forward the development of a Marxist state theory that you know, has all but stagnated since the debate of the 1970s between Miliband and Poulantzas and the important pioneering work that they did on the state. I think there's a real need today to continue to build on that work and push forward into new theoretical frontiers that were only barely glimpsed or barely addressed by either Miliband or Poulantzas a generation ago. One of which is the role of the economic apparatus. Which is a theory, which is a conception that Poulantzas developed in his last book, State Power Socialism, which complements the political and coercive apparatuses as a kind of trio that Poulantzas laid out of state apparatuses with different functions. So the coercive apparatus is concerned with military force and social order, maintaining discipline, doing the actual physical coercion that the state imparts upon actual human bodies. The ideological apparatus is concerned with legitimation and the reproduction of the social order, the reproduction of social harmony to support the existing inequitable and exploitative social order. And the economic apparatus is the functions of the state, undertakes the practices within the state of directly reproducing capital, directly circulating, is directly organically integrated with the circulation and expanded reproduction of capital. And Poulantzas, when he developed the concept of the economic apparatus, was really thinking about the French, dirigiste state. He was thinking about, the mixed economy, the fact that the state was kind of directly managing or directly owning capitalist enterprises and running them as publicly owned concerns. And he was trying to think through the contradictions that invited into the state complex as it expanded its economic role in this way. But what Poulantzas didn't talk about, but which ended up being the most important state economic component of the state economic apparatus during the neoliberal period, and indeed the center of state power, beginning in the late 1970s with the Volcker shock onward, was the central bank, right? In the case of the American state, the Federal Reserve. So there's very, very little state theory work that's been done at all, and certainly nothing in Poulantzas and Miliband really dealing with the role of central banks and the fact that the dominant seat the central seat of power of the dominant class fraction, that is to say financial capital, is actually a bank, but yet a bank that is internalized within the state institutional complex. So the most important center of state power, the central seat of class hegemony of the dominant fraction of capital, financial capital, is a bank that is internalized within the state. So beginning to think through the nature of the economic apparatus in the neoliberal period, particularly in terms of the role of central banks, I think is a major theoretical vista that Marxist state theory really does have to think a lot more about. And we try to take up some of that in our chapter, Scott Aquano and I, in this volume. And the way that we really do this is we kind of begin from Trump's election in 2016. And Trump's election in 2016 was anomalous in American political history in many respects, one of which was that he won with very little, if any, backing from big capital. Big capital primarily opposed Trump in 2016. Of course, that changed after his election, to say the least, in many respects. But at the time of his election, he won with very little support from big capital, very little support from the dominant political elite. Most of the sections of the Republican establishment came out against him. And one of the reasons for that was that Trump came to power pledging to undertake what his top advisor, Steve Bannon, referred to as an attack on the administrative state, right? They wanted to, quote unquote, deconstruct the administrative state. And this project of deconstructing the administrative state was very connected to their critique of globalism, as they called it, right? By which they effectively mean globalization. And from their perspective, the kind of network of regulations, taxes, and trade agreements, multilateral institutions at the international level that the U.S. had organized and established as the basic constitutive institutional basis of the American empire since World War II, and certainly transformed the forms of those international institutions with the neoliberal period. These were the very foundations of the American empire. That those had actually infringed upon American sovereignty, and that the restoring American greatness actually meant attacking and deconstructing the fundamental institutional pillars of the American empire at the international level and within the American state, which is incredibly closely, intimately connected. So big capital wasn't exactly happy about this, however much it may have been simply instrumental to winning an election, and therefore, potentially pushing forward the interests of big capital, as we all have seen throughout the neoliberal period. Big capital, the large corporations, multinational corporations, didn't particularly find this to be a palatable message, and by and large, they refrained from supporting Trump as a result. Now, to make matters more concerning for a large capital for big multinational corporations. Upon coming to power, Trump actually began hollowing out the centers of power within the administrative state. And he did so by refusing to make key appointments at important administrative agencies. He did it by slashing budgets using executive prerogative to dramatically reduce budgets for state agencies. And this didn't just pertain to the usual Republican Party whipping, sacrificial lambs or target institutions such as the Environmental Protection Agency. This actually extended to the State Department. I mean, they really, slashed the State Department. It extended to the Treasury Department in some ways. And so this raised the question then of to what extent was this, first of all, what was the nature of this conflict going on inside the state that Trump was unleashing and participating in? And second of all, what were the limits of this deconstruction of the administrative state? And how far could this go, and what did it mean for both the American state as an institution in relation to its own social formation, but also for the American empire? And in order to answer those questions, you really need to look at Marxist state theory, because the fundamental issue that's at stake here is the relationship between the political and the economic. And so this requires us to kind of return to the classical Marxist state theory literature and to try to develop it in relation to the particular conjuncture that gave birth to Trump, namely that of American imperialism as it developed since World War II. And I think in this respect, Trumpism, those readings on the left that saw Trumpism as a symptom of American decline, really, that interpretation really was a misreading. And in fact, that misreading was so significant as to lead to a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of the political conflict and political crisis that was underway from 2016 onward during the Trump presidency. In fact, in order to understand this conflict and understand the political crisis that Trumpism represented and intensified, one has to understand that this crisis emerged precisely because the US remains at the center of global capitalism. In other words, the crisis wasn't a result of American decline. The form that this crisis takes, the form that the political conflict within the state unleashed by Trump takes, can only be understood if we understand the role of the US remaining at the center of global capitalism. And the political contradictions of managing global capitalism then take the form of this conflict within the American state. Understanding the internalization of the contradictions of managing capitalist globalization that has been the unique prerogative of the American state since World War II. Understanding that then allows us to perceive how the contradictions of managing global capitalism, of serving as the central state force, organizing the world market, ensuring the stability of free international flows of capital, etc. That crisis those contradictions became internalized within the American state. And we can only understand that process if we understand how the American state remains central. So the political contradictions of globalization, of managing globalization, are internalized within the American state, and they take the form of an attack on this role of the American state in managing globalization from within the state. So the attack on the American state's role in managing global capitalism in the form of Trumpism, in the form of these internal contradictions within the American state, that attack can only be perceived if we see how it's happening on the basis of the centrality globally of the American state within the world system. So the key question then becomes, does the American state still have the capacity to manage global capitalism? And the stakes of this question for all capitalist states are incredibly important, because insofar as the American state's capacity to manage global capitalism is damaged, that then has immediate ramifications for all capitalist states everywhere, whose own ruling classes, whose own legitimacy, whose own expanded reproduction relies upon and is fundamentally linked with this role of the American state in reproducing global capitalism. So this attack then within the American state on the American state's imperial functions, and that includes the multilateral institutions at the global level that are the institutional foundations of American imperial power at the global level. This takes the form of an attack on the central bank and the rise of a kind of nationalist blowback against the American state's global role, ongoing and very important global role, and the contradictions within the capitalist class then, between petty bourgeois type forces, smaller capitalist forces, self-employed types, and big capital, can only be perceived if we understand how big capital remains very much embedded in globalization, very much involved in internationalized production and all the rest of it, whereas other sections of capital are increasingly left out of the benefits of that. So to begin addressing some of these questions, we begin from the really excellent and essay by Panich and Gindin in the 2019 Socialist Register called "Trumping the Empire," which remains, one of the most important analyses of the nature of Trumpism during Trump's first term, and therefore an important analytical basis on which we can begin to think through what a second Trump term might look like. And in that essay, Panich and Gindin wrote, I'm just going to read a quote here, is that they wrote, "Perhaps the greatest irony of central bank independence, explicitly designed by states and capital working together to protect the making of global capitalism from the progressive tendencies of democratic pressures on elected governments, is that it may yet come to be seen as saving global capitalism from the chaos of the Trump presidency. The greatest test of this will be the Fed's behavior in the face of the gathering financial storms abroad and their likely contagion effects." So basically, Panich and Gindin in Trumping the Empire, this 2019 Socialist Register essay, are pointing to the ways that this internalization of the contradictions of managing globalization within the American state is taking the form of a conflict between a component of the ideological apparatus, that is to say, the electoral institutions, the parties, the democratic functions of the state that had the function of representing the popular will, expressing the popular will, and therefore legitimating capitalism, right? It's taking the form of a contradiction between those apparatuses, the representative apparatus, the ideological apparatus on the one hand, and the economic apparatus on the other, in which power had been concentrated over the neoliberal period, during which the form of state power, the structure of state power, which Poulantzas referred to as authoritarian statism, which Rafael referred to earlier, took shape. As state power was concentrated in the economic apparatus, the role of parties, elections, etc., became increasingly circumscribed, became increasingly limited. Democracy, as is often said, as is often put, democracy was hollowed out, and the most important centers of state power came to be insulated from the pressures of democratic institutions and accountability and public oversight in any form. Not that the state was particularly democratic before, obviously, but this was a very careful and very deliberate insulation of the dominant centers of state power from those kinds of from those forms of accountability and popular input. And so then you have this contradiction between state apparatuses. The economic apparatus of the American state remains central for reproduction of global capitalism, and yet the ideological apparatus increasingly becomes a vehicle expressing the nationalist, petty bourgeois, and small capital based blowback against the American state's imperial role, which has come at the expense, of course, of working people, and come at the expense of some sections of small capital and the petty bourgeoisie, although other sections, of course, have been very much integrated with that project and benefited immensely from it. So understanding then the contradictions within the American state and the contradictions within American capital requires that we understand the global role of the American state and its ongoing importance for global capitalism. So these contradictions come to be internalized within the American social formation in this way. So the chapter that Scott and I wrote then, departing from those kind of theoretical and historical starting points, tries to lay out how it is the case historically, how it came to be that the development, the formation of an American imperial state since World War II took place through an intertwined processes of globalization, financialization, and the creation of a more authoritarian state. These three things were completely, intimately linked together. So the development of authoritarian statism, the rise of finance to become the dominant fraction of capital, and the globalization of industrial capital, the globalization of American capital, are three completely interlinked and interdependent processes that can't in any way be separated. And so, of course, Trump is an authoritarian figure who had aspirations to create a more authoritarian structure of political power centered on his person. But this project came up against the limitations and barriers posed by an existing form of authoritarianism, namely neoliberal authoritarianism, which Trump's personalized, charismatic right-wing authoritarianism challenged. Because neoliberal authoritarianism, authoritarian statism in Poulantzas's terms, directly relied upon an impersonal, bureaucratic form of authoritarianism, whereby individual elected leaders and party forces, etc., democratic representative functions, were to be insulated from the authoritarian centers of state power. And so Trump was challenging that structure of authoritarianism that had evolved within the neoliberal state with a different form of authoritarianism, right, that he wanted to impose, one that would be very much centered on the presidency as an elected figure, at least, for the time being, elected figure. Who knows what his broader designs were in that respect? I wouldn't want to speculate. And so then in order to then decode and kind of uncover the nature of this conflict, it requires us to then think through what it is that's holding the neoliberal authoritarian state in place. What is it that is reproducing this structure of power? And in this respect, again, we need to return to the concept of the relative autonomy of the state, which Poulantzas developed and which Rafael referred to earlier, right? The state is not just an institutional complex, as mainstream social science and social democratic theory holds. It's not just an institutional complex removed from its embeddedness within the reproduction of capitalism and therefore class power, right? It's not fully autonomous from the social formation, from the structure of economic exploitation that we call capitalism. The state is embedded within that logic and fundamentally conditioned by it, and its primary function is to reproduce it. So that means that these authoritarian structure of the neoliberal state is also not simply something that can be changed at the political level through political intervention, institutional processes. It's embedded within the basic structure of capitalism itself. So the rise of the economic apparatus and the concentration of state power within the central bank as a component of the economic apparatus was not just something that contingently happened at random. It wasn't just a result of financial institutions lobbying the government and forcing it to do what they want, instrumentalizing the state. It reflected and was part and parcel of the restructuring of capitalism, such that finance came to play a structurally more prominent role within the overall reproduction of the system, right? The rise of finance was essential for enabling the free circulation of investment internationally. That was essential for resolving the 1970s crisis for industrial capital as well, right? So the neoliberal alliance among capitalist fractions that emerged from the 1970s crisis hinged on accepting the hegemony of finance within accumulation, because it was finance that provided the basic infrastructure for circulating investment internationally that allowed industrial corporations to restore their own profitability, right? And so they relied upon the internationalization of capital markets and financial flows to circulate, to create internationalized production networks that allowed them to cut labor costs by exploiting cheaper labor abroad and to discipline workers at home, thereby restoring their own profits. So, and that part and parcel of that the hegemony of finance and the globalization of capital was the concentration of state power in the hands of the central bank, particularly around initially the move to a system of floating exchange rates. And I'm not going to get into all the economic details, but it required, the movement away from Bretton Woods and towards a neoliberal monetary regime fundamentally relies upon the continuous intervention of the central bank to maintain currency values and to stabilize exchange rates. And on top of that, it requires continuous coordination among central banks at the international level, which was the task undertaken by the American state and the American state economic apparatus. So the internationalization of state power, right, the coordination among central banks, both reinforced the installation of those institutions from popular intervention, and that also was reinforced by their internationalization, right? So the internationalization of state power reinforced the authoritarian concentration of power in those institutions at the international level, and that in turn was a key foundation for financialization, which was in turn a key foundation for the globalization of all capital. So the development of an authoritarian state, the globalization of capital, and and financial hegemony, financialization as it's called, were all part of the same interdependent process, and that as a totality, as a historical process, all of those different aspects and phenomena were majorly responsible for driving and reproducing the authoritarian structure of state power. It's not just a matter of institutional rules. It's not just a matter of a piece of paper called the Constitution. It's about the structure of accumulation and the linkage of the state to the structure of accumulation, such that when accumulation itself is restructured, state power is restructured in order to enable the reproduction of financial hegemony, and also as a reflection of the rise of financial hegemony. So the 1970s crisis was one in which there was a profit squeeze, and the profit squeeze was emerged from the decline of productivity growth that had characterized American capitalism since World War II. Productivity growth continuously expanding was the basis of what is often called productivism, the social democratic bargain, such as it existed between trade unions and large corporations in the United States, that allowed both wages and profits to rise together. When those productivity gains slowed, increasingly workers' wage militancy squeezed profits, preventing the restructuring necessary to restore profitability. So what that basically meant was that the state had to turn at that moment from legitimation to accumulation. If we say, as Rafael said earlier, that the state basically has three functions, maybe Rafael adds a fourth in terms of the role of social reproduction. But if we say the state has accumulation, legitimation, and ideological functions, the trade union rights won by workers through the intense class struggles of the 1930s in the form of the New Deal was all about legitimation, right? It was about legitimating an exploitative capitalist system by allowing workers legal trade union rights, right? And that complemented the other aspects of the ideological apparatus, including elections and so on, with the notion of industrial democracy that would legitimize capitalism because workers have now the right to collectively bargain with bosses and be represented by trade unions that they freely form and elect the leadership of and all the rest of it. So the response of the state in the context of the intense class struggles from below was to tremendously expand, more in Europe than the United States, but also in the United States, was to expand its legitimation functions, to re-legitimate the system and demobilize workers by expanding its legitimation functions, including extending trade union rights. That held in place a certain regime of accumulation up until the 1970s crisis, when trade union wage militancy prevented the restructuring necessary to restore profitability and needed to be disciplined. So the legitimation functions of the state came into contradiction with the accumulation functions of the state. And so what needed to happen was a turn away from legitimation and toward accumulation. And that corresponds with a diminishment of the role of the ideological apparatus and an expansion of the role of the economic apparatus, because those are the apparatuses that carry out those functions, as well as the formation of a more coercive state, right? A state that is not particularly concerned with legitimation is by definition one that is then more coercive and has less regard for simply nakedly carrying out the coercive measures necessary to sustain social discipline, right? So this turn away from legitimation and toward accumulation coming out of the 1970s crisis resolves the 70s crisis. It restores class discipline, and it enables the globalization of capital. But it also paves the way for a legitimation crisis, right? Because after all, legitimation is a necessary function of the capitalist state. And in the event that it is unable to sustain the perception that the system is legitimate, that invites all kinds of different morbid symptoms, to use the phrase from Gramsci that Rafael mentioned earlier, including things like Trump. And so far as we all know, it's been the right that has primarily benefited from this legitimation crisis. Initially, the state's response to the 1970s crisis and the rising, the upward pressure on prices that was taking the form of workers' wage militancy, that was resulting from workers' wage militancy, was to do wage and price controls, right? And throughout the 1970s, Nixon, Ford, Carter, all toyed with various different mandatory and voluntary wage and price control regimes, whereby they would basically say, you know, we are going to set prices and wages through state institutions. There's a state agency that's going to be responsible for setting wages and prices, and that will be the way we control inflation. And it didn't work, partly because the wage and price control regimes had to be implemented by elected officials, right? It was the president ultimately, and also members of Congress to a significant extent, that were responsible for managing those programs of wage and price controls, and therefore setting what the wage rate would be. And since in the context of a profit squeeze, the main issue is that wages need to be restrained, wage growth needs to be restrained, it's very difficult for elected officials to go back to their constituents during election time and say, vote for me, my policy is to cut your real wages, right? That doesn't really work very well. So the wage and price control regime was plagued by the constant need to restrain real wage growth without making it look like you're restraining real wage growth. So there was a need to allow wages to appreciate a bit and make it look like you're controlling prices and holding prices down. But in real terms, the ultimate objective had to be to hold down real wages. And there was real concern in the Nixon administration onward that people would start demanding that planning or price controls be expanded to other sectors of the economy, and that it would be a kind of fundamental challenge to markets and market allocation of capital that could come with that. So in order to address this problem, they just concentrated power in the central bank. The inflation crisis and the decade-long failure of wage and price controls was resolved by the extreme centralization of state power in the Federal Reserve, as Paul Volcker was appointed by Jimmy Carter in his last year in office, and hiked interest rates to double-digit levels, higher than they've ever been before, which basically provoked a massive recession, led to huge bankruptcies and so on of capital, but also disciplined labor. It raised the unemployment rate, increased competition among workers for jobs, and brought down wages, and therefore brought down inflation eventually. So the 1970s crisis then was resolved by the centralization of power within the economic apparatus, and particularly in the central bank, with the appointment of Paul Volcker. That resolved in the inflation crisis and ultimately paved the way for the enactment of a new round of globalization from the 1980s onward that would, again, hold down wages, internationalize capital, and all the rest of it, open up the vast low-wage workforces of the global periphery to exploitation. And this was very openly celebrated by neoliberal theorists as the independence, regulatory independence, right? The independence of the central bank, the independence of the key regulatory agencies that were responsible for underwriting the globalization of capital. And regulatory independence is just another word for authoritarian statism. It means that these institutions do whatever it is that they have to do to make capitalists, to secure the expanded reproduction of capital, regardless of who wins the elections, and regardless of the will of the electorate. That's what regulatory independence means. We don't want to interfere politically with the technocratic functioning of these bureaucratic institutions with trivial things like popular accountability and democracy. So control over economic policy was increasingly taken out of the hands of democratic institutions or somewhat democratic institutions like Congress, which took the form of fiscal policy and state spending, and increasingly concentrated in the central bank, whereby monetary policy, which enacted monetary policy, which became the key kind of macroeconomic policy lever. So again, we have a de-democratization, the shift from fiscal to monetary policy, the imposition of fiscal constraints on the state was about de-democratizing the state and concentrating power in the hands of the central bank. Now, after the 2008 crisis, how am I doing for time? Am I okay? How long have I been going on for? Am I okay still? Okay. I can kind of come to a conclusion here as I just reflect on the role of Trump. After the 2008 crisis, the powers of the central bank were tremendously expanded. And it is that context, especially to regulate the banking system, but also through the quantitative easing programs, whereby trillions of dollars in liquidity were pumped into the financial system with absolutely zero approval from Congress, right? The passage of the so-called bailout bill did not refer to quantitative easing. The Treasury and the Federal Reserve took that money and used it to nationalize the banking system. Meanwhile, they undertook a bailout, if you like, many, many times the size of the Troubled Asset Relief Program and the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act through quantitative easing and poured liquidity into the financial system with no congressional authorization, while also intensifying regulations on the banking sector. So it was this aspect of the expansion of the powers of the economic apparatus that Trump really wanted to attack. And Trump and Bannon really wanted to go after. They wanted to pare down the extent to which the powers of the central bank had been expanded following 2008. And Scott Equano and I, in the chapter, we go through a lot of empirical data, original research that we conducted on the expansion of regulations since 2008 and the impact of Trump appointees on whittling that regulation down, as well as other powers and functions of the economic apparatus, central bank, Treasury Department, et cetera. And we find that basically there was a minimal ability of those officials to seriously restrict the power of the central bank in underwriting the integration of global capitalism. And the reason is because, these institutions are fundamentally embedded in globalization. They are fundamentally organically linked with the internationalization and expanded reproduction of capital at a global level. The only way, and this has important lessons for the left, the only way you can take on those institutions and fundamentally restructure them involves taking on capital. You cannot talk about taking on the power of the Federal Reserve, taking away its independence, restructuring the way it works, its relationship to elected officials in the executive branch. You can't talk about doing that without talking about a direct frontal assault on capital, because this is the seat of power of the dominant fraction of capital, and it's essential to the basic structural reproduction of capital at a global scale. So taking on the central bank then means taking on capital, taking on big capital in a big way. And Trump, of course, had no capacity or desire to do that, nor did he have any alternative to put in place once he was having this fight with capital that would replace the structure of neoliberal globalization, right? He had no alternative, and he wasn't really willing to have that fight. So as much as Trump and the hard right elsewhere is increasingly talking about taking on the independence of central banks, I think we have to be really critical of this and suspicious of how far that can really go without engaging in a much more radical and direct confrontation with big corporations that any of these forces are really talking about doing, at least thus far. What they're really expressing is the resentment, or expressing and seeking to capitalize on, is a resentment of sections of small capital and the petty bourgeoisie at the fact that the interests of the dominant fractions of capital have come to be directly embodied consolidated and represented within bureaucratic agencies like the central bank, while the weaker fractions of capital, smaller capitalists, medium capitalists, petty bourgeoisie, have been left to be represented in Congress and in parliamentary institutions, which are increasingly irrelevant to the making of the most important aspects of macroeconomic policy. So lobbying Congress, seeking representation on the terrain of Congress in the context of authoritarian statism is actually a sign of weakness, not strength of capital, right? The strongest sections of capital have their interests safely represented and institutionalized within centers of state power that are safely insulated from the chaos and interruptions and contingencies of the representative institutions like Congress and parliaments. And so, this means that in terms of the left, our approach to class struggle in the terrain of the state, can't be limited to winning elections. It has to involve a much more deep and thoroughgoing transformation of state power, because the real centers of state power are insulated from elections, and they'll continue to do the same thing, at least they're supposed to, regardless of who wins. And also, it means that Trump, the ability of the far right to fundamentally remake globalization faces sharp limits without fundamentally challenging capital to an extent that is much more significant than they have. And so to come full circle then and return to Panaginides' question in Trump and the Empire about the real test of whether the independence of the central bank, that is to say, the structure of authoritarian statism, ironically, can save global capitalism from an attack from the right rather than from the left, as it was originally intended to do. The test case for that question came in 2021 with the COVID crisis, when of course, after the essay that I'm referring to was written, when the Federal Reserve unleashed all the firepower that it had in 2008 and then some to get us through, to get capital and the capitalist society that it governs through the COVID-19 crisis. And it demonstrated, I think, that the argument that Scott and I make in the chapter was completely correct, which is to say that the basic powers of the Federal Reserve were not diminished in any substantial way by the Trump project of deconstructing the administrative state. As a matter of fact, all of the bulk of the expanded capacities after 2008 were sustained and even expanded upon during the years when COVID-19 shutdown of the economy, was the kind of central conjunctural factor in major economic crisis that the state was trying to manage. So I think it is clear in retrospect now that the Trump project of deconstructing the administrative state was not successful as it pertains to the Federal Reserve, and that was demonstrated by the way that the Federal Reserve managed the COVID-19 crisis. So with that, I can turn it over back to you guys, and we can have maybe some Q&A or some discussion of these issues.
Thanks for that, Steve. That was actually magnificent. There was a tremendous amount of structural and agential scaling of analysis there, and the kinds and scope of activity that you covered was grand. It was something else. I'm actually excited to watch this again, just to sort of like really key in and dig in on the nuances of it. We're kind of running a little tight on time, and so we've got some questions coming in. I just got like a paragraph and a half from your co-author Nate Holdren from this collection that we also had on the first edition of this talk. But before we get to that, I wonder if you all have some points on the one hand to navigate and talk to one another about your chapters, your talks, your thoughts on some of this today. I'm also, on the other hand, going to use a little moderator privilege and kind of give a little direction to it, to say that, over the weekend, quite obviously, there was an enormous event in U.S. history and in our global context today of the attempted assassination on Trump. And so with such a focus of this particular context, and with Steve's last focus on the context of Trumpism and COVID, I wonder if you all might, in also talking with one another about your mutual work, try and tease out or give us some thoughts on what this context that we're going through today, not just of the Trump assassination attempt, but also of the nomination of J.D. Vance as the vice president and the broader Project 2025 sort of like political scope might mean in the context of Marxism and the capitalist state towards a new debate, if that makes sense.
Are you asking me? Sorry. Sorry, I didn't realize if you're asking me.
Yeah, I think that I'm kind of opening it up to everybody, but I think Steve you'd be a great person to start with.
Yeah. So Project 2025 is very interesting. I think one has to be careful when discussing it because so much of it has been, I think it's been colored in a certain way by liberal voices who want to use it as a way to win the election without actually offering a program that benefits working people in any way whatsoever, namely Joe Biden and the Democrats. But I think it does represent something very significant, and I'm actually working on a book chapter on it right now, which is that more significant than the political program that is contained in the 900 some odd page volume that everybody keeps quoting from is the political organizing that is lying behind it. So Project 2025 is a project that's being led by the Heritage Foundation, which represents a kind of relatively marginal group of billionaire financiers who have tended to be outside of or at the very right edge of the kind of Republican establishment ecosystem, which is geared towards organizing a base for what is called national conservatism, which is effectively MAGA politics and is effectively the name that kind of neo-fascism is going under in the current American political context, or a particular form of neo-fascism. And what they're basically trying to do is organize this base of small capitalists and petty bourgeois individuals, self-employed types, to serve as a base for Trumpism and to serve as a base for the fundamental long-term remaking of the Republican Party around national conservatism, which involves all kinds of conflicts with the other strains of conservative ideology, quote unquote, within the Republican Party, but is really about consolidating that and institutionalizing that base for Trumpist politics at a national level and even international level in some ways, actually, between groups of kind of small businesses and self-employed people. And it's an attempt to build an alliance among civil society organizations that represent these interests. And one of the ways that that's navigated is by allowing each of these organizations, or the most important examples of individuals associated, organic intellectuals, Gramsci would call them, associated with these organizations and social forces, to author a chapter in this 900 some odd page volume that they produced, which is kind of part of a series that they've been doing since the 1980s. And so it is about the remaking of Republican Party politics. It is about building a base for a very hard turn to the right within the Republican Party. Its support by big capital as of now is tenuous and limited outside of sectors like oil that are endangered, possibly facing extinction in the event that some kind of green transition is undertaken on the one hand, and industries that are uncompetitive, such as steel on the other hand. So you have a kind of certain fractions of big capital that are either endangered or uncompetitive, align themselves with small business, small capital, and a section of the traditional petty bourgeoisie, self-employed people, trying to mobilize as well a section of the kind of lumpen proletariat, as Marx called them, people who have become lumpenized through precarious employment, unemployment, the growing precarity of working class life during the neoliberal period. And that to try to establish a political force on the basis of that alliance that could rebalance or shift, renegotiate somewhat the alliance in power between the big capitalist firms, both industrial and financial, that have benefited primarily from globalization and been the leading forces in the power block on the one hand, and then these smaller capitalists, petty bourgeois folks on the other hand. So the small capitalists are by and large part of the alliance in power. They are part of the capitalist class. But what this is really about is about rebalancing, renegotiating the relationships among the different fractions of capital that comprise the alliance in power, on behalf of smaller capitalists, to have their voices and interests be heard in a greater way. And that does include things like limited tariffs. That does include things like certain kinds of protections that big capital has tended to not want, and that have not, that the elimination of which has been the kind of defining feature of globalization. And I think J.D. Vance, the appointment of J.D. Vance to be the vice presidential running mate with Trump, points to the total victory within the Republican Party of national conservatism and MAGA, right? It means that there is no need to even, in a public-facing way, construct an alliance between national conservatism and other strains of Republican Party ideology. So Mike Pence was like part of the evangelical, he represented the evangelical part of the Republican coalition. J.D. Vance is hard MAGA. So this represents the full and complete capture of the Republican Party by national conservatism, and it indicates that J.D. Vance, Trump imagines, I'm sure, that he'll be his successor, and that project of national conservatism will remain hegemonic within the Republican Party. And Project 2025 connects with that in the sense that it's an attempt to build an enduring institutional base for that, in particular class fractions that can allow that process to be sustained over time.
I had a question for Ava, but also kind of an observation that I think either one of you can speak on. So I was really taken by the quote from Balibar, or the reference to Balibar, of where he says that class war is the making visible of class struggle in Marx. And kind of listening to Steve's presentation, also thinking about what I had said, I wonder if it's at all, how significant is it that during that period that we've been talking about, that neoliberal period of like the last 50 years, the language and the rhetoric of class war has always been mobilized by the bourgeoisie against the workers, right? Like against the proletariat. Like it has been entirely like a top-down kind of discourse, whether we talk about criminalization, where we talk about the use of that language to grow carceral and policing power. The fact that the left, that 50-year period has been a period of left fragmentation in the global north. And so actually I was just wanted to hear a little bit more about whether you think it's relevant or interesting that, right now that language coming from that period of authoritarian neoliberal governance that we're talking about has always been kind of unidirectional, right? It's always the elites mobilizing it against the working class. And the quick observation is that, I wonder if when we talk about Trumpism today and this kind of new mutation of Trumpism, what we haven't really talked about is the courts, right? And the way that actually this Republican institutional creep that we were talking about, the rise of national conservatism, has been anchored to such a large extent going back to Trump's first term in the Supreme Court and all the rulings of the Supreme Court in terms of deconstructing the administrative state, in terms of rolling back labor rights, reproductive rights, all of those things that we kind of, trace to the great society of the 1960s, like the last remnants of that have been kind of eroded. But I'm wondering if actually that is itself a point in which you would have an alignment between, on the one hand, the national conservative movement as having, as represented in court rulings, right, the 6-3 majority on the Supreme Court, and on the other hand, the central bank of the American state, just in the sense that so long as the court does not roll back property rights, so long as it does not kind of roll back legislation attacking workers, So long as it kind of maintains that like legal form and all of its appendages for the accumulation of capital, then maybe there actually won't be as much of a conflict of interest between, on the one hand, central bank authority and that kind of depersonalized power in the interest of capital that you're talking about, Steve, and on the other hand, the political and ideological terrain that the national conservatives and MAGA are now conquering, precisely because the courts themselves are kind of like their one major weapon at this moment. So,
I mean, I can jump in quickly. On the second point, there's not something, by the way, obviously, I think it's more for Steve as well, but there is an interesting debate generally to be had, I think, about thinking more clearly, not only about Yeah. Oh, great. Sorry. Yes, just a very quick, just immediate reaction to Raf's second point about the role of the courts. And as a lawyer, and I think I'm the only legal scholar in this collection, really, properly so. I mean, Rob. But there is more work to be done, generally speaking, about the relationship between state theory and legal theory and how they articulate themselves in different kind of governmental apparatuses. And the only also one more abstract thought I would have is that, obviously this is the notion of a division of power is a bourgeois construction, right? I mean, we know all too well that the executive can legislate, a court can legislate, it's there's nothing close to kind of these rigid boundaries that we've always been told. But I do wonder to what extent we ought to be thinking about the interaction between executive, parliament or legislative and courts, and in the way in which precisely it is through it is one of the ways in which the capitalist state works itself through the contradictions that, for example, you have outlined, Raf, capital accumulation, social reproduction crisis, or ideological legitimation, because they kind of sort of also calibrate one another. And as you say, so long as, so a court, for example, will not trump on property rights, etc., but, it can still give in on other fronts so that the state restabilizes itself and so forth. So I think it would be an interesting question to try to theorize that a little bit more in depth. And as far as the war metaphor is concerned, I mean, yeah, it is quite funny that class war has been so unidirectional, but part of me also thinks whether this is first quite more of a US specificity. I'm not even sure that in the continental Europe, there's not as much as the notion of class war like this, and as a sort of unidirectional modality of state power and so forth. And it is true, that this is obviously what a lot of people are afraid of, is that the language of war just fuels divisions within the working classes, just depoliticizes the class struggle, and etc. So I'm just trying to think about different ways in which the left, however, can reappropriate the legacies of class war. And to me, recentering the class war as at the heart of Marxist theory, including Marxist state theory, is important because it gives you a different starting point. Like it's a question of a theory of revolution, a theory of historical change. And the class war is crucial to that. And so it's not just about critiquing the bourgeois state or critiquing capitalist accumulation, but also thinking more in dialogue about the more concrete aspects of Marxist thoughts, which was how to make the revolution under whatever conjunctures like we are faced with, which remains. And I think also for me, there is a lot to be reclaimed about more generally, perhaps a legacy of revolutionary Marxism. I mean, a lot of people, Gramsci, Lenin, used the language of war of maneuver, wars of positions, wars, that really foregrounded far more the questions of strategy and revolution than more abstract thinkings about just the critique of the capitalist state have done so far.
Thank you for that response, Eva. I'm going to jump in real quick because I know that Eva has to go. Everybody's got some stuff to get going on. So I'm going to give you one quick question from a Q&A from your co-author, Nate Holdren. It is specific in a certain way to things that everybody's talked about today. And then I know, Ava, you definitely have to leave. If we need to sort of filter out, we can do that. In general, if Raf and Steve, you all want to say a little more, we can do whatever you guys want. But I'm going to ask you this question from Nate. He says, fantastic panel. Each of you has talked about crisis. I'd like to hear a little more of your thoughts on this. Some left thinkers, like Nancy Fraser, for instance, seem to think crises are openings that offer opportunities for the left, while others, like Soren Mao, seem to think crises are periods where there are even fewer opportunities for the left. I'm curious what you see them as, or maybe you want to reject this whole framing, in which case I'd love to hear why. That's from Nate Holdren.
I think that's a really great question. I want to say yes and or yes to both in some capacity, but I think ultimately it depends. As I kind of gestured towards at one point, crises are socially embedded responses to particular balances of social forces and social dynamics at a given moment, right? They're historical. They're driven by conflict. They are ultimately the results of internal social contradictions that are, plural, multiple, and potentially at a given moment can coalesce into a broader, bigger ruptural crisis. I think it's just thinking in terms of left strategy, as Ava has been rightly pushing us to do, the ability to assess a given moment of crisis, to assess the particular balance of forces that exist at a given moment, was one of the brilliant tactical skills of Lenin, of Gramsci, of many other 20th century Marxists, of Rosa Luxemburg and others. And I think that that's a skill that has been I think, increasingly difficult to find on the left, at least I think in the Anglophone world. Partially, I think, because of a certain, I think, erosion of left institutions, left legacies over the course of the neoliberal period that I think we were only now spent the past 15 years or so trying to build up by, in part by rediscovering these old texts, by talking about state theory again, by working through the dilemmas that we are being confronted with in the present. But for all of that, the ability to grasp crisis in thought, intellectually, and to try to understand and assess it relative to the balance of social forces at a given moment means necessarily thinking of it as at least possibly open-ended. as not predetermined, but as something that is a moment of relative destabilization of the existing order. Now, that doesn't mean that the left will ever necessarily have an upper hand in these moments. Most of the time, very likely not. But it is a certain kind of moment of novelty in a way that at least gives us a glimpse of what could be. And I think that that's how I would like to think about crisis, as a moment where rigid institutional and structural conditions break down, or at least open themselves up to change and to the ability to be affected by some other force.
I mean, I could jump in very quickly and leave then Steve to sort of have a more elaborate answer if you want. Because I'll unfortunately, I'm very sorry, it's quite late here, so I'll have unfortunately to go. Nate, thanks. Yes, obviously, very good question. I think, to be honest, probably from my talk, it was quite clear that I don't think either or. I don't endorse one approach. I don't endorse the other. And I mean, I have a great admiration, in particular, for Soren Mao's book, and it's a great inspiration, the way he sort of describes the mood compulsion of capitalism, etc. That's brilliant. But he himself also says very clearly that he's working at a very high level of abstraction. I'm not even sure that Soren Mao himself necessarily would answer your question in quite the sort of dichotomous ways in which they have now been presented. But I may be kind of wrong about that. But I think, for me, I concur with Raf that crises are moments of, I think, destabilization is a very good word, where new possibilities emerge, others get foreclosed. But there is kind of a flexibility in the new language or advocacy that sort of may make some arguments more possible than others. And I think Marx himself very often saw that, the class struggle was not necessarily always the originator of crisis as much as the executor of crisis, and these kind of things come together. It's not like, the primacy of class struggle versus the primacy of capital. That's not what I mean. But it's rather to explain that the two are intermingled. And I think it's as important to Marx's theory that, part of the laws of motion of capital are also an endemic crisis condition, right? This is also, and he didn't believe, of course, that this will itself, without any agential work, lead the way to revolution. But he was also, I think, in my view, quite clear that that they provide sort of moments of opportunity. Yeah, this is what the class struggle must seize on.
Okay. I think I don't really have too much to add to what Raf and Ava just really put very well. I think, in thinking about crises, it's always useful, to my mind, to return to the old theories of collapse and breakdown as a starting point for thinking of what this means. And according to those older theories, crises were supposed to do all the work of socialist organizing and activism, right? We don't actually have to worry so much about organizing the working class, because the great crisis will come and capitalism will collapse. And then at the historically appointed moment, the working class will step into power and replace capitalism with socialism. And this was basically some version of this, far less crude than I just put it, was of the Great Crash, was held by Marx up until 1858, when he was working on the first draft of the Grundrisse. the crisis was underway as he was working on the Grundrisse, the 1858 crisis, and he was speculating that this would be the great crisis that would end capitalism. But then, of course, the result of that was that capital was strengthened as a result of that crisis, right? Capital ended up being rejuvenated, being restructured, and being emerging from that crisis stronger than it went into the crisis. And so I think, we have to keep in mind, I think, that as much as, the mass European working class parties and trade unions, emerged out of the crisis of 1873 to 1896, one of the longest crises in capitalist history. And just as during the course of the Great Depression of the 1930s, industrial unionism in North America and Swedish Scandinavian social democracy took shape. And in the 1970s and 1980s, we saw, the new social movements. Crises are also periods in which capital recovers its dynamism, right? They are periods in which capital, faced with a contradiction in the system, as David Harvey called them, right? Crises in this sense are irrational rationalizers of an always unstable capitalism. And I think that's a pretty good way of thinking about it, right? Crises are times in which capital restores its rationality, regains its dynamism, and returns to health in a restructured form. So the lesson there, I guess, is that where and when there are not working class forces organized and capable of intervening to shape the course of events, crises are a disaster for the working class. They're ugly. There are times in which the working class is defeated, in which capitalism regains its strength, in which possibilities for social change of a revolutionary or reformist kind are foreclosed under the exigencies of the emergency of the moment. And so the question isn't, I don't think, so much one of, are crises this or that, but rather, if are we expecting crises as in the old collapse theories of collapse? Are we expecting crises to do the work of socialist organizing for us and automatically lead to one outcome or another? And obviously, I don't think that makes much sense. So the problem then becomes kind of shifted onto how do we organize working class forces such that the working class and progressive agents can serve to direct the course of events in a progressive direction during moments of crises, which in that context do provide opportunities. If the working class forces are not present, crises present opportunities for capital to actualize a reality that benefits it at the expense of the working class, with appalling social effects in many cases for workers. So the question is really one of the balance of class forces and the state of socialist organizing, more than crises in abstraction.
Great. Sorry, everybody. I had transferred my computer. I'm having a problem with it. I apologize for that. I'm gonna. We're really tight on time, so I'm gonna just ask one more question. I've been asking this at all of the panels, and I'm curious what your thoughts are here. The book that we've been talking about the last few weeks is Marxism and the Capitalist State Towards a New Debate, with a lot of amazing authors, edited by Rafael, Khachaturian, and Eva Nanopoulos, which we've had today. Steve Maher has a great essay in it with Steve Aquino, if I'm not mistaken. That's Scott Aquino?
Yeah, Aquino.
Yeah. Oh, Aquino, forgive me. Yeah, appreciate it. The thing that people have sort of brought back to my attention and asked very early on, which I thought was pretty good, and is a pretty good question to close on, is to say, what do you want people to get from not just your contributions to the collection, but also from the project at large? What do you hope people get from this book? What do you hope people can do with it? And then alternatively, what are the terms of the debate, new and old? And where should we be going with that?
Steve, do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, it's your book. Maybe you should be the one to really answer this. I guess I just generally would say I think there's a real need. Leo Panitch wrote in 1999 about the impoverishment of state theory, that went on with the rise of the so-called new institutionalism in social science, which reinforced very narrow social democratic and reformist politics around the infinite reformability of the capitalist state and the lack of a direct linkage between class power and state power. And so, there was a kind of process. And then, of course, the globalization theory garbage, whereby states had supposedly been circumvented or marginalized by multinational corporations or whatever, which obviously, as everybody would have to agree today, is sheer nonsense. That there had been an impoverishment of state theory. And I think, to be honest, he wrote about that in 1999, reflecting on the experience of playing a leading role in developing Marxist state theory with Ralph Miliband, and how limited their project actually ended up being before the kind of intellectual trend or fad of the moment shifted onto something else. This remains an issue. The state theory remains impoverished, and there is a real need to reassert a relevant, practical, empirically grounded Marxist state theory to understand the world around us that's unfolding every single day and the logic behind that. And that includes things like what I'm talking about with central banks, as well as many other areas of research, including perhaps especially what Rafael's been talking about with social reproduction. And so, things like, Robert Brenner in the New Left Review talking about escalating plunder, seeing the state in very crude instrumentalist terms, beholden to financial parasites who are ripping off the public, it's just not serious. And I think the same thing with Duran's recent book, the one before the techno-feudalism one. Financial parasites are blackmailing the state and forcing it to serve their interests, and instrumentalizing it in service of their narrow agenda. And I just think it just indicates the impoverishment of state theory and the need for a much more serious, systematic, structurally grounded theorization of how the state is organized, how it functions, and why. And I think a rigorous Marxist theory of the state is the only real paradigm for undertaking such a project.
We spoke about crises and the conditions under which we published this volume and where these discussions have been taking place. So, if we just look around us, we're dealing with escalation of distinctive and layered crises, right? A kind of global civilizational crisis on the ecological level, political and social crises across the world. Discussions of the state on the left, and especially within the Marxist tradition, have tended to kind of vacillate over the course of since the 19th century, in part because they're, in some ways, the state is a certain lens through which you can read the strength of revolutionary social struggles. So in some ways, the proximity to power or a certain kind of upswing of left organizational forces also makes the discussion of the state much more prescient and tangible and real. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that the conversations out of which this volume emerged, since, dating back to a couple of years before the pandemic hit, were also moments of a kind of discussion about the revival of left social movements across the North Atlantic, right? In the United States and in the UK, in Europe, and elsewhere as well. And, of course, also in Latin America and the global South. So there was a certain moment in which the discussion of the state became very tangible once again, because it really forced people to confront this question of what is the nature of political power in capitalist societies in the 21st century. And how do we deal with these, right? So Steve mentioned kind of theories of globalization a moment ago. In some ways, those are a symptom of left disempowerment dating back to the 1980s and throughout the 1990s, right? Where the state then becomes actually less relevant because what you are dealing with is a kind of much more diffuse global order in which there is no kind of clear locus of political power. I think the Marxist tradition has actually been really good at pointing to the state as a kind of organizational locus of power, one that we must kind of tackle both in theory but also in practice. And so reopening some of these debates out of those kind of cul-de-sacs where they ended up in the late 1970s for reasons that I won't go into now, is in a way to kind of bring our theory up to date with some of the practices that had already been emerging at that time. So our hope as editors, as co-editors, is that people will not just kind of settle for the accounts that we've been presenting here at Red May over the last week and a half, but actually push us and pick up these discussions and take them in their own relevant directions and actually kind of make Marxist state theory great again. So I'll just end there.
An amazing place to leave it. We're gonna do our best to get that message out everywhere. You heard it here first at Red May that we must make Marxist state theory great again, and we will, and have been starting this July. This is part 3 of a series we've been doing on Marxism and the capitalist state towards a new debate, again edited by Rob Hunter, Rafael Khachaturian, and Eva Nanopoulos, the latter two we've been talking to today with Steve Maher. If you have enjoyed these talks and you enjoy the kinds of work that we do at Red May, the kinds of connections that we want you to have with a lot of people in active militant practice and theorization, then please do us a favor, simply like and subscribe on YouTube. It just helps with all sorts of views. You can also join us and help participate wherever you are. If you go to our website, redmayseattle.org, we have a volunteer form. We've been getting tons of people back in, especially this year, which is great, from all over the world that want to see Red May propagating in places that they are, hosting events where they are, as well as jumping in and navigating some of the new digital terrain that we're all finding ourselves on. Also, if you've got a little extra cheddar in your fridge, you can subscribe to us and help us out on Patreon at patreon.com/RedMaySeattle. We've got lots of new content that's becoming available there, lots of new ways in particular to engage in these talks and some things that we've got on the horizon. Again, just from this series, I really can't emphasize enough how much you should pick up a copy, whatever way that you can, of Marxism and the capitalist state towards a new debate. Ask your library to pick it up. Ask your friends to pick it up. Ask somebody if they have a know on where to get a copy of it. You'll gain so much from it. Anyway,
LibGen for those who are in the know.
You didn't hear it from me, but you did not hear it from Red May. So thanks again for joining us, y'all. We were so glad to have you. And this concludes this Red May July series. We look forward to hearing from you all in the future and from all the people we have coming down the pipeline in August. I've been Sean, your moderator today. Thanks for joining us, and good luck. Godspeed.